I still remember the exact sound of 2 empty chairs. Not silence. Chairs make a sound even when no one sits in them. A kind of absence that hums. I was sitting on a folding metal seat in the university auditorium, gown draped over my shoulders, cap pinned crooked because my hands were shaking too much to get the bobby pin right. Behind me, 2 seats. Reserved. Marked with a folded index card that said reserved for the family of Danielle Moore in my own handwriting, because I hadn't trusted anyone else to save them. Both empty. I want to tell you this story the way it happened, in order, because the order is what makes it hurt, and the order is what makes the ending worth it. So let's go back. Not to graduation day. Further back than that. Back to the day I learned exactly where I stood in my family, and exactly what that would cost them, 8 years later, when I made sure they understood it too. I grew up in Manchester, in a narrow brick house on a street where every garden looked the same, in a family of 4. My father, Richard, a quiet man who ran a small accounting firm. My mother, Elaine, who had given up a nursing career to raise us and never quite forgiven anyone for it. My younger sister, Chloe, 3 years behind me, and me, Danielle, the older one, the sensible one, the one who was supposed to need less. That word, sensible, became a cage before I understood what a cage was. Chloe was born with a kind of light in her that people noticed from across a room. She was funny without trying, pretty in the effortless way that made adults coo over her, and from the time she could walk she had a gift for making people feel like the most important person in her world. My mother adored her without complication. My father adored her too, though his was quieter, a soft laugh at her jokes, a hand on her shoulder, an extra 10 minutes of attention that somehow never made its way to me. I don't say this to fish for sympathy. I say it because it's the truth, and the truth is the foundation everything else was built on. When Chloe struggled in school, my parents hired tutors, sat with her every evening, celebrated a C+ like it was a Nobel Prize. When I brought home straight A's, my mother would glance at the report card and say, "Good, that's what we expect from you," and go back to whatever she was doing. I was 9 when I first understood the shape of it. Chloe had a dance recital, a school thing, 20 kids in matching leotards shuffling through a routine nobody outside the room would remember by dinner. My mother took the whole day off work to help with Chloe's hair and makeup. That same week, I had a spelling bee I'd been practicing for since September. I came in second in the regional round. My father picked me up 20 minutes late, still in his work clothes, and said, "Sorry, love, your sister needed me to run lines for the recital." He hadn't asked how the bee went. I told him anyway, in the car, to the back of his head, because he was checking his phone at a red light. There were 1,000 versions of that afternoon over the years. 1,000 small erosions. Alone, none of them would break a person. Together, they carve a canyon. By the time I was 17, I had built an entire personality around not needing anything from them. I got a part-time job at a bookshop so I wouldn't have to ask for spending money. I applied to universities without telling them until I had the acceptance letters in hand, because I didn't want to watch them care less about my future than they cared about Chloe's homework. I learned, the hard way that children learn things, that love rationed unevenly doesn't disappear, it just goes looking for somewhere else to land. Mine landed on ambition. If I couldn't be loved the way Chloe was loved, I decided, I would be undeniable. I would build a life so solid that no one could ever again look through me like glass. I got into a top economics program in London on a partial scholarship. I remember the night the letter came. I ran downstairs holding it, and my mother read it, smiled, said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart," and then turned back to the kitchen table where she and Chloe were picking out fabric swatches for Chloe's 6th form ball gown. I stood in the doorway for a full minute. Nobody looked up again. I went to my room and I didn't cry. I had stopped crying about this sort of thing years before. Instead, I made a promise to myself, the kind of quiet, cold promise that 17-year-olds make in the dark and then, terrifyingly, keep. One day, they will have to see me. And when they do, it will be too late for it to mean what it should have meant. I didn't know yet how literally that promise would come true. University was, for the first time in my life, a place where I existed as myself and not as Chloe's older sister or the sensible one. I threw myself into it. I graduated top of my class in my second year's exams, secured a coveted summer placement at a financial firm in Canary Wharf, and by my final year I had a graduate job offer already signed before most of my classmates had finished their dissertations. I called home every few weeks. The calls were short, pleasant, and empty in the way conversations are empty when neither person is really asking anything real. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I had my own life now. I had built the thing I promised myself I would build. Then came the invitation to submit names for graduation seating. 2 guest seats per graduate, front block, the ceremony reserved for top honor students. I was graduating with a first-class degree and a departmental prize, the kind of thing you only get to walk across a stage for once. I called my mother, genuinely excited for the first time in years, and told her the date. July the 14th. I told her it mattered to me. I actually said the words, "This one matters to me, Mum," which was as close as I had come in a decade to admitting I needed anything from her. She said they'd be there. Both of them. I spent 3 weeks planning it in my head, small, embarrassing fantasies, if I'm honest. My father shaking my hand outside the auditorium. My mother's eyes actually wet for once over me. I told myself I wasn't hoping for too much. I was hoping for the bare minimum. 2 people in 2 chairs, watching me finish what I'd started entirely without their help. 10 days before the ceremony, Chloe announced she'd gotten into a modeling competition final in Leeds, a regional heat for some agency scouting event, the kind of thing with maybe 40 entrants and no real prize beyond a development contract that never seemed to lead anywhere. The final happened to fall on July the 14th. I found out my parents weren't coming through a text message. Not even a phone call. A text sent by my mother at 11 at night, 3 days before my graduation. Asterisk, darling, huge conflict. Chloe's final is the same day as your ceremony, and it's such a big opportunity for her. We really need to be there to support her. We're so proud of you, though. We'll celebrate properly when we're back. Love you, XX asterisk. I read it 4 times. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed in my shared student flat, phone in my hand, waiting for the second message that would say, "Just kidding," or "We found a way to split the day," or anything. It never came. I didn't call. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't do any of the things you might expect. Something in me had gone very still and very cold, the way water goes right before it turns to ice. I texted back a single line, asterisk, "Okay. Have fun in Leeds." Asterisk, and then I put the phone face down on the desk and didn't touch it again for 2 days. On the day itself, I filled out the guest cards anyway. Reserved for the family of Danielle Moore. I told myself it was tradition, that the seats belonged in the family section whether or not anyone filled them, but really, and I can admit this now, some small, humiliated part of me still hoped. Hoped that a car would screech up outside, that my father would come jogging in halfway through, apologizing. Hoped right up until the moment the dean called my name, and I walked across that stage and turned to look out at the crowd and found 2 folded index cards on 2 empty chairs. Nobody in that auditorium knew what those empty seats meant. To them it might have looked like 2 guests running late, or 2 people who simply couldn't make it. Only I knew what it actually was. A scoreboard, tallied since I was 9 years old at a spelling bee nobody asked about, finally read out loud in a room full of strangers. I finished the ceremony. I smiled for photos with friends who lent me their families for an hour. And on the train back to my flat that evening, I opened my laptop and wrote a document I titled, with the kind of dark humor that gets you through days like that, Long Game. Docs. It was, at the time, nothing more than a list of goals. It became, over the following 8 years, a plan. I want to be clear about something. This isn't a story about sabotage, poison, or crime drama revenge. What I did entirely by building my own life so well that the truth simply became unavoidable. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't do it on purpose and with their reaction, one day, specifically in mind. I took the graduate job in Canary Wharf. Within 2 years, I'd moved to a boutique financial advisory firm specializing in family wealth structuring, an industry, I'll admit, I gravitated toward partly because I found the psychology of it fascinating. Who gets what, who is trusted with what, and why. I was good at it. Genuinely good, not just diligent. I had a talent for seeing the emotional currents running under financial decisions, probably because I'd spent my whole childhood reading a household's emotional weather for signs I mattered. Meanwhile, I kept in loose contact with my parents. Birthday calls. A Christmas visit every second year, always brief, always polite, always distant. I watched from the outside as the pattern I'd grown up inside of continued without me in the frame. Chloe's modeling competition, as it turned out, led nowhere. She didn't place in the lead's final, and the development contract evaporated within a year, as these things usually do. She drifted through a series of half-finished courses and jobs, a beauty therapy diploma she didn't complete, a stint managing a friend's boutique that closed within 18 months, a long relationship with a man named Marcus, who my mother adored and who turned out, for years to have quietly run up debt in Chloe's name. Every time, my parents were there. Fully, completely, unconditionally there, the way they had never once been there for me. They co-signed loans for her. They let her move back home twice. My father, at 61, delayed his retirement by 3 years, partly, I learned much later, to help cover the debt Marcus had left behind. I didn't gloat over any of this. I want to be honest, some of it genuinely saddened me, because whatever our history, Chloe was still my sister, and watching someone flounder isn't satisfying, even when a colder part of you registers it as vindication. What I did feel, with each update, was a growing, settled certainty, the story my parents had always told themselves, that Chloe needed them and I didn't, had never been about what either of us needed. It had been about who was easier to love without effort. And stories like that always come due eventually. By 29, I was a partner at my firm. By 30, I'd started my own boutique consultancy specializing in intergenerational wealth planning, advising families, often wealthy ones, on how to structure trusts, inheritances, and estate plans in ways that actually reflected fairness rather than favoritism, because I had made it my professional mission to understand a subject I'd once been the victim of. It was, in a strange way, the most honest career a wounded person could choose. I spent my working life making sure other families, invisible children, got what they were owed. I bought a flat in Islington outright, in cash, at 31. I didn't tell my parents until my mother saw it mentioned, almost in passing, on a mutual cousin's social media post, tagged at my housewarming. She called me, surprised, asking why I hadn't said anything. I told her, quite simply, you never asked how things were going, so I stopped assuming you wanted updates. She didn't have a response to that. There was a long silence on the line, the first genuinely uncomfortable silence we'd ever shared, and then she changed the subject to Chloe's upcoming birthday. That was the year I understood the shape the ending would take. Not through some elaborate scheme, through simple, patient truth. My parents, it turned out, were heading toward a retirement they hadn't properly funded, having spent a significant portion of their savings bailing Chloe out over the years. My father's accounting firm had shrunk during a rough patch in his early 60s, and he'd never quite rebuilt the client base. They weren't destitute, but they were, for the first time in their lives, going to need help from someone. And there were, as it happened, only 2 children available to give it. 8 years to the month after my graduation, my mother called and asked, with a carefulness in her voice I'd never heard from her before, if I would come to a family dinner. Not a birthday, not a holiday, just a dinner at the house I grew up in. Chloe would be there too, she said. It felt important to her, she said, that we all sit down together. I said yes. I want to be honest about my motive walking into that house. I wasn't there for a reconciliation fantasy anymore. I'd let that particular hope die a long time ago, somewhere around my mid-20s, and grief, once it's fully processed, makes room for clarity. I went because I was curious, and because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to see their faces in a room where the truth could no longer be quietly managed. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood homes always do. My mother had aged more than 8 years should account for. There was a tiredness around her eyes that hadn't been there before, the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent years absorbing someone else's crises. My father hugged me at the door, a real hug, longer than any he'd given me growing up, and said, "You look well, love," in a voice that cracked slightly on the last word. Chloe was already at the table when I walked in, and for a moment, I'll admit this, I felt an old flicker of the childhood competition, the reflex to brace myself against comparison. But the woman sitting there wasn't the golden child of my memory. She was 31, tired-looking, dressed in clothes that were trying a little too hard to look put together. She smiled at me, genuinely, and said, "It's really good to see you, Danny," and I realized, with a strange pang, that whatever resentment I'd carried, I had never actually carried it toward her. She hadn't built the cage. She'd just been the one it was built around. Dinner was quiet at first, full of the small talk families use to test whether deeper water is safe to enter. It was my father who finally said it, halfway through the main course, not looking up from his plate. "We need to talk to you both about something. We're not doing as well as we let on. The house, we might have to sell it. There isn't much left after everything." He didn't say after Chloe, but the sentence hung there anyway, and I watched Chloe's face go pale and still. My mother reached across and took my father's hand, and then, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard her use, she looked at me and said, "Danielle, I know we don't have the right to ask you anything. I know that. I've thought about your graduation more times than you probably think I have, over the years. I think about it a lot, actually." Her eyes were wet, the wetness I'd once fantasized about, arriving 8 years too late and for entirely the wrong reason. "I don't expect you to help. I wanted to be honest with you before we asked Chloe, because it isn't fair to only ask her." I sat with that for a long moment. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt, more than anything, a kind of exhausted clarity, the sensation of watching a scale that had been tilted my entire life finally, slowly, level itself, not through anything cruel I had done, but simply through time and truth doing their unglamorous work. "I'm not going to pretend the last 20 years didn't happen," I said. "I'm not going to sit here and tell you the empty chairs at my graduation didn't matter, because they did, more than almost anything else in my life. You need to actually hear that, not as an accusation, as a fact you're allowed to sit with." My mother nodded, crying properly now, not defending herself, which was, I think, the first time in my life I had ever seen her not defend herself. "But," I continued, "I didn't build the life I built to punish you. I built it because it was the only way I knew how to matter to myself, since I couldn't figure out how to matter to you. And I'm not going to let you lose this house out of spite, because that's not who I decided to become." I told them I'd help, not by paying off everything quietly and vanishing, the way I might have as a younger woman still trying to earn love through usefulness, but properly, transparently, as an equal. I offered to sit down with my father's accounts, professionally, the way I would for any client, and help restructure what could be restructured. I offered a loan, at a real interest rate, documented properly, not a blank check, because charity erases dignity, and I wanted, for once, for this to be a transaction between equals rather than another silent sacrifice absorbed without acknowledgement. And I said, looking at Chloe rather than my parents, that if she wanted, I'd help her too, not with more bailouts, but with an actual plan, the kind no one had ever sat down and built with me, because apparently I'd needed no plan, only rescuing. Chloe reached over and squeezed my hand under the table and said, quietly, "I always wondered why you pulled away from all of us. I used to think it was because you thought you were better than us. I don't think that anymore." "I didn't pull away because I thought I was better," I told her. "I pulled away because I learned, very young, that I had to build my own chair, because nobody was going to save me one." I think people expect a story like this to end with a scene of grand comeuppance, parents groveling, a daughter turning her back and walking out triumphant, doors slamming, an audience somewhere cheering. That's not what happened, and I've come to believe that version of the story, however satisfying to imagine, would have kept me exactly as small as those 2 empty chairs once did. Revenge that requires someone else's ruin is just another way of building your worth around someone else's gaze. What actually happened is quieter and, I think, more honest. My parents are in a 2-bedroom flat now, not the house I grew up in. We sold it 18 months after that dinner, and I helped manage the sale so it went for a fair price rather than the fire sale figure my father had been quietly dreading. They are not wealthy, and I am not the family's silent benefactor either. I made sure the arrangement had real terms, because respect and rescue aren't the same thing. Chloe, it turns out, is quite good at logistics work. Once someone actually sat down and helped her find something suited to who she is rather than who she was expected to be. She works at an events company now. We talk every week. Real talks, not performances of talking. My mother told me, on my most recent birthday, the first birthday in my adult life she remembered without a reminder, that she thinks about those graduation seats often, and that she understands now they weren't really about one Miss Ceremony. They were about a habit of attention, built and repeated for 18 years, that told one daughter she mattered and the other daughter she could handle mattering less. She said she can't undo it. She's right. She can't. But here's the thing about empty chairs. They don't stay empty forever, and who fills them eventually says everything about who a person actually became. Mine got filled not on graduation day, not by the people who should have been there, but over 8 years, by a version of myself I built entirely without their help, sitting quietly at the head of a table they now, finally, need a seat at. I didn't get revenge, not the way I imagined it at 17, furious and unseen in my bedroom. I got something stranger and better, the truth, arriving on its own schedule, in its own voice, asking, for the first time in my life, to be let in rather than assuming it already had a place. I let it in. Not because I forgot the empty chairs. Because I finally didn't need them filled anymore to know exactly who I was.